So here's a personal example of how going to the wrong people for relationship advice can completely mess up your relationship. So there was a time period in my relationship with my husband where this was his daily schedule. Monday through Friday, this was the basic daily schedule. Around the same time, for whatever reason, he started letting other men get into his ear, and single men, mind you. And in all of the years that we'd been together, we'd never had an argument about him feeling like he was being emasculated in our relationship or feeling like he needed to put his foot down in our relationship. But as soon as these single men got into his ears, they started to influence him in a very negative way, and it started having harmful effects on our relationship. So we go and see a couples therapist, and the couples therapist asked my husband, "So what is it that you're looking to get out of couples therapy?" And my husband says, "I just want things to go back to the way that they were." And I'm like, "So you want things to go back to the way that they were? You mean the same time period where you were complaining about feeling emasculated in our relationship, the same time period you were saying that you needed to put your foot down in our relationship?" And my husband was like, "Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking." So this is a personal example to explain to you all why going to the wrong people for advice about your relationship can actually cause really harmful damage, sometimes to the point of no return. Hey everyone, my name is Melissa Rochelle, and I'm a holistic wellness and relationship coach. So let's talk about Irreplaceable Men 101, and the tool here is going to be about how to lead during conflict. So most people, when they're looking for relationship advice, they tend to go to their friends. Men tend to go to other men, and women tend to go to other women. Sometimes we go to our mothers, our sisters, and other women that are close to us in our lives. But the problem with this is that just because someone loves you doesn't mean that they have good conflict resolution skills. It doesn't mean that they have good relationship building skills. So the key is to not go to those people specifically for relationship advice. You can go to them when you need, some nurturing, some care, some, cheerleading or whatever. But when it comes to the advice for your relationship, it's always best to go to people who have the skills to manage conflict effectively and to build relationships. So here's a personal example of how going to the wrong people for relationship advice can completely mess up your relationship. So there was a time period in my relationship with my husband where this was his daily schedule. Monday through Friday, this was the basic daily schedule. He would wake up in the morning and play 2K. Then he would go to work. He would come home at about 3 p.m. I would make him lunch. Then he'd watch ESPN or play 2K until dinner. Then I'd make dinner. Then he'd watch the game if there was a game on that day. Then we watch a movie or TV. Then we get intimate at the end of the night, and then we go to sleep. And then this would basically be his schedule Monday through Friday, rinse and repeat. Around the same time, for whatever reason, he started letting other men get into his ear, and single men, mind you. And in all of the years that we'd been together, we'd never had an argument about him feeling like he was being emasculated in our relationship or feeling like he needed to put his foot down in our relationship. But as soon as these single men got into his ears, they started to influence him in a very negative way, and it started having harmful effects on our relationship. So we go and see a couples therapist, and the couples therapist asked my husband, "So what is it that you're looking to get out of couples therapy?" And my husband says, "I just want things to go back to the way that they were." And I'm like, "So you want things to go back to the way that they were? You mean the same time period where you were complaining about feeling emasculated in our relationship, the same time period you were saying that you needed to put your foot down in our relationship?" And my husband was like, "Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking." So this is a personal example to explain to you all why going to the wrong people for advice about your relationship can actually cause really harmful damage, sometimes to the point of no return. So it is best that when you're looking for relationship advice, that you go to people who truly have good guidance for you. Do not go to your mom, to your sister, solely because they love you and solely because they're in your life, because they just may not have very good conflict management skills. They just may not have good relationship building skills. Okay, so let's talk about how to lead your relationship when it is in conflict. So there are two unhealthy conflict management styles, and they are called the maximizer and the minimizer. The maximizer versus minimizer behavior pattern shows us how different people react during conflict. So maximizers enlarge their energy, so they become more dramatic and more outwardly emotional, versus minimizers tend to implode, so they tend to get very quiet and they tend to shut down. So to get a mental picture of what this can look like, maximizers are sometimes called tigers or hailstorms, and minimizers are sometimes called turtles. During conflict, the maximizer is the pursuer and tends to fight, while the minimizer will withdraw and retreat and tends to flee during a conflict situation. So statistically speaking, women are usually maximizers and men are usually minimizers. Maximizers feel their way through a conflict and minimizers think their way through a conflict. The minimizer tends to accuse the maximizer of making a big deal out of everything and calling them overly dramatic. And the maximizer tends to think that because the minimizer shuts down, it's because they don't care about how they've made the other person feel. The maximizer tends to feel like the minimizer doesn't care because they're not as emotionally expressive as they are. But what's actually happening in this dynamic is that the minimizer, which is usually the man in the relationship, is trying to stop the conflict from getting too out of control. So they're trying to de-escalate the situation. So they think that by shutting down and not matching the maximizer's energy, that they are actually de-escalating the situation. But what's actually happening is the more the minimizer shuts down, so the more the man shuts down and gets less expressive, the more the maximizer or the woman is going to get even more hysterical or even more dramatic. Because remember, the maximizer interprets emotional expression as care and love. So because the minimizer or the man in this relationship is not showing outwardly that he cares, the woman tends to think that he does not care. So she'll try even harder and harder to get him to show expression of emotion in order for her to feel like he cares about her. So neither the maximizer nor the minimizer is a healthy way of handling conflict. It's just a coping mechanism that we've learned throughout our lives in order to manage stress. In the most primitive part of our brains, we confuse psychological distress with physical survival distress. So if we are in conflict and just a verbal argument with another person, our fight or flight response can still kick in even though we are not in physical danger in that moment. So I'm going to say this in a very simple way, but just to make the point that what happens in conflict is that our limbic system or our emotional brain takes over in the situation. The thing with the emotional brain is that it's much faster. So it's much faster to react, but it's also less accurate. So it'll make decisions that seem like it's protecting us in the moment, but it's actually doing more harm than good. So an example of that would be, let's say you see a shape on the road that looks like a snake and you're walking by, you might automatically run because your emotional brain has taken over and said, just run. But when you come back, you realize that it's just like a water hose just laying there. So actually it was not a snake in the first place. But this is basically your emotional brain taking over and telling you what to do in that moment in order to keep you safe. So then your emotional brain is a lot faster. So it makes quick decisions, but it also makes less accurate decisions. Versus your thinking brain, sometimes called the prefrontal cortex, is a lot slower, but it makes much more accurate and logical and rational decisions. So when you are in conflict with your partner, your emotional brain can get activated and make bad decisions because your emotional brain thinks that you are in danger. And that danger is perceived or imagined. You're not actually in physical danger most of the time when you are in conflict with your partner, or at least I hope not. So remember, your emotional brain is the older, more primitive, faster responding part of your brain. And then your prefrontal cortex is the slower but more accurate part of your brain. So it's much more logical, much more rational. But it takes a lot longer for it to come online when you are in conflict with another person. So the best way that I've ever seen this described is kind of like this. So imagine this is your brain. Can you see that? So imagine this is your brain. So imagine your fist like this, closed, is your brain, right? And inside right here, this is your emotional brain. and this is your prefrontal cortex, okay? So emotional brain, thinking brain. So what happens is when you are in conflict with another person, if you ever heard that expression pop off or flip your lid, so what's actually happening is your thinking brain is literally popping off and your emotional brain is taking over. So your emotional brain is making really bad decisions in that moment, but it's just trying to protect you. So your emotional brain is under the assumption that in that moment you are in distress and it is trying to protect you. And these are the ways in which we can cause really irreparable damage in our relationships, because our emotional brain is thinking we are in danger when it's just a nice, calm conversation that's actually happening. So again, remember, in a conflict situation, the maximizer fights, so they become much more dramatic, hysterical, and much more outwardly emotional. And the minimizer flees, so they shut down. You're not getting any emotional expression from them. They can actually physically flee and leave the situation, like go for a drive, or they can just emotionally completely shut down. So the thing is that the maximizer, and again, this is usually the woman in the relationship dynamic, not always, but usually statistically speaking. So the maximizer wants connection. And by connection, what that maximizer is actually looking for is emotional engagement. And the more the minimizer does not give them emotional engagement, the more hysterical, the more dramatic, the more outwardly emotional she's going to become. And on the other end, the minimizer during conflict needs space and time to think things through, because the minimizer's goal is to de-escalate the situation. The problem is that by shutting down, the minimizer is actually escalating the situation. He is not de-escalating the situation. So the woman views fighting it out as him caring about her, and the man thinks fighting it out, and the man takes fighting it out as a lack of care. And he can feel very overwhelmed by her big emotional expressions. But again, remember, the more her emotional expressions get bigger and bigger, the more he's gonna shut down even more. So they're just gonna keep playing off of each other. She's gonna get more emotional and he's gonna shut down more. She's gonna get even more emotional, he's gonna shut down even more. And this will just keep going on and on until someone decides to take control over the conflicting situation. So we hear this a lot, where people say that women are more emotional than men. And whether or not you believe that it doesn't matter. The point is that if you are a man and you do believe that women are more emotional, then it is your responsibility in a conflict to de-escalate that situation, because you are saying that you have more control over the thinking, logical side of your brain. Therefore, you have the capability in that situation, in that conflict dynamic, to de-escalate the situation. What can he do to lead in a conflict situation with his girlfriend or his wife? What he can do is not let the situation get out of control in the first place. One of the tools that he can use is called a safe word. So a safe word is basically a word that you say, either she says or you say, when the both of you are going back and forth and the conflict is not being resolved. You're just going on and on and on, and it's going nowhere. So one person in that relationship would say the safe word, and this would be an indication that we are really off track and we need to stop and take a few breaths. So for example, a few years ago, the safe word that my husband and I chose was Laurel Yanny. If you remember, back then there was this audio that was floating around on Twitter where it was saying, what word is this audio saying? Is it saying Laurel or is it Yanny? And my husband and I chose to use Laurel and Yanny because it shows that different people hear different things. So sometimes we may intend on saying one thing, but the person that's listening to us is actually hearing a completely different message. So whenever we would say Laurel Yanny, it was, oh, we're off track, we're misinterpreting each other, we need to stop and start again. The other thing he can do is employ a method called love talk. I want to say here that one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of times when we want other people to change behavior, we think we can just tell them to do it. Why don't you just do this? Why don't you just do that? But the best way to help other people change behavior is for us to model the behavior ourselves, because usually we start to pick up the behaviors and habits of the people that we're around. So if you start to model healthy conflict resolution for her without telling her what to do, she's just going to pick up on that behavior without you having to do anything. This is just human relationship dynamics. We just tend to pick up the language, the words, the behaviors, and the actions of the people that we spend a lot of our time with. So this is the love talk formula. The L stands for listen. You want to pay attention to her body language and look her in the eyes while holding her hands. The U is for understand. So you want to ask questions to make sure you understood what she was saying. And then you want to repeat what you heard her say and confirm with her that you heard her correctly. Then the V stands for validate. Then you want to validate her feelings. So you want to put your feelings and needs aside and tell her you understand how she feels. So first step, listen. Second step, make sure you understand. Third step, validate. And at the end of that, you want to ask her, what does she need moving forward? So anytime you are having a disagreement with your partner, you want to make sure that at the end of that conversation, there is an objective, like a solution, so that the next time this happens again, you know what the solution is and what she's looking for, what she's asking for. Now, this is the part where a lot of men might ask, well, if I'm just taking care of her feelings, what about my feelings? But this is the important part of love talk. The way that you want to do this is that whoever approaches with a feeling first goes first. So you're going to listen to her feelings. You're going to make sure you understand her feelings by asking her questions. You're going to validate her feelings, and you're going to ask her, what does she need moving forward? Then you're going to reverse the roles. Then it's your turn. Then she's going to listen to you. Then she's going to ask you questions to make sure she understood what you said. Then she's going to validate your feelings. Then she's going to ask you what you need moving forward. So this is the best way to handle any conflict in your relationship. If it gets out of control, first say the safe word, Laurel Yanni. Both of you stop, take a few deep breaths, go do something else if you need to and come back to it in a few minutes. But whatever it is, stop if it is not working. Then approach each other with love talk. Listen, understand, and validate each other. And the last part of leading in conflict is knowing what your apology language is, and also knowing what the apology language of your partner is. So most of us by this point have heard of the love languages, but very few people have heard of the apology languages. Have you ever been in a situation with someone and you're like, well, I already said I'm sorry, but they still keep going on and on and on, and you don't know what else to do because you've already said I'm sorry? It may just be that that person's apology language was not just in I'm sorry. So the apology languages lets us know how we feel heard and understood when someone apologizes to us. So here are the 5 apology languages. Number 1, expressing regret. This is saying things like, I am sorry for, and this shows that you know what you did wrong and why it hurt your partner. The second apology language is called accepting responsibility. This means saying, I was wrong. And this shows that you admit your mistake or wrongdoing and you take responsibility for it. The third apology language is called making restitution. This is where you say things like, what can I do to make it right? And this shows that you love your partner and value reconciling the relationship. The fourth apology language is called genuinely repenting. This is when you say things like, I'll try not to do that again. And this shows that you genuinely want to change your behavior and you agree that it was wrong. And the fifth apology language is called requesting forgiveness. This is where you say things like, will you please forgive me? And this shows that you want to be forgiven and you admit that it was your fault. So how do you find out what your apology language is and what the apology language of your partner is? So there's 2 questions that can help you determine that. Question number 1 is to ask yourself, what do I expect the person to do or say that would make it possible for me to genuinely forgive them? And the second question is, when I apologize to others, which of the 5 languages do I think is the most important? So by asking yourself these questions and by also asking your partner these questions, you're more able to understand what an apology looks like to your partner, because there are different languages. I'm sorry is good enough for one person, and I'm sorry may not be good enough for another person. Another person might need you to say, I'm sorry, and I know what I did wrong, or I'm sorry, and here's how I can make it right. Okay? So if you found this information to be helpful, remember to like, subscribe, and share this information with everyone you know, whether single or in a relationship. You might just be doing some really great work. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you.